Up next, for a conversation on cleaning up tech, please welcome Ellen Pao, the former CEO of Reddit. And welcome back, The Atlantic's Gillian White.
Alan, so I know for a lot of people, your lawsuit kind of made you the very first face, very first name that people associated with this idea that there was a problem with discrimination in the tech sector. I'm wondering, since that time, do you think the extent of these problems where it comes to discrimination, both gender, racial, and otherwise, has become fully apparent?
No, I think it's starting to come up. It's starting to show where the problems are. But I hear stories from individuals every day, and their stories are much worse. Like the people who have had the worst stories have not come out. And that's why you hear people talk about, oh, I read this in the press, the previous speaker. He doesn't know what's actually happening in the companies. He doesn't understand what's actually happening in the workplace. And it's much worse than you can imagine than from the stories that I'm hearing.
What are some of the most prevalent things that you're hearing? Obviously, not asking you to name names.
Yeah, I think that there is actually some organized activity in companies around discriminating against people based on their gender and based on their race, that there are groups of people who are organizing to share ideas and share methods and tactics. I think it's interesting that there are and kind of the ways that they do it is actually spread out and being influenced from outside the organization as well.
Oh, interesting. So after you left Kleiner Perkins, you went to Reddit, and you were exposed there to kind of a different type of discrimination, different type of, I guess, harassment. And it was a lot of what we're talking about now, what we've been talking about today, what we talk about a lot in media, which is internet trolls, internet harassment. I'm wondering kind of how was the experience of that different than your experience of kind of in the workplace, kind of a more traditional type of discrimination?
It was interesting because, again, it was like often it was organized. It was on other platforms coming into our platform, Reddit. And the scale and the toxicity was just much more blatant. Like there was in the workplace, people, they try to get along. We described our workplace as a family, and you were civil to each other in person. And here it was just a free-for-all. Like, the things that people would say on the internet, and now, not even anonymously, right? It's just people who are willing to talk on the internet and say terrible things, terrible threats to your family, and then coming after you, where they want to, share your address and share your personal details, so you can be harassed offline as well as online.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit more about the handling of harassment on these platforms. One of the conversations we often have in media is that everyone gets harassed, everyone gets trolled, but if you, at some point, take a look at the way that my white male peers are trolled and harassed on the internet versus how me and other women of color are harassed on the internet, the difference is quite stark. Yeah. I'm fine with people saying, that my work is trash or I'm very dumb, but, somebody saying, I'm going to violently assault you or, you should be re-enslaved, those are kind of the gaps that we are talking about. And the thing that platforms often say to commentary like this and continued harassment is that it is free speech. People are allowed to come on these platforms and say whatever it is that they want, as long as they do not actually, as long as they just fall short of violating the law. So I'm wondering how you think about, as someone who has worked on these platforms, kind of that use of free speech and that definition of free speech and the use of it as a defense.
I think there are two big things about free speech I want to talk about. One is, free speech was intended to protect against government action. So there's not actually a First Amendment protection to speaking on these different platforms. Platforms are private, and they have the ability to, restrict whatever content they want to. So this idea that there's free speech rules that apply to companies and they have to share all sorts of information is actually not true. And that's something that people have kind of clung to in a kind of confused way, and it has been used as a tool to allow companies to do whatever they want and not do anything. So I think of free speech, when platforms use that argument, it's lazy and cheap. Like, I don't want to put anybody on top of the platform to manage the content on the platform, so I'm just going to call it free speech, and we're going to allow it to be a free-for-all. I think the second piece that's interesting is that in other areas, companies are investing in limiting speech. So they have huge teams of people who are trying to prevent spam from being on the platform. So they're restricting the speech on the platform every day in significant ways. They remove spam. Now they're removing bots. They're removing some other types of content, but child pornography gets removed. So there's this constant limitation of free speech, if you want to follow the broader kind of misguided definition, that happens every single day, and you don't see it being complained about or criticized.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, Reddit, for instance, recently banned some alt-right sites. There was kind of a broad, momentary banning of, Alex Jones and InfoWars at a certain point. Do you think that platforms are actively trying, or do you think that it's just kind of when things really reach a critical mass that they're acting?
It has been very PR responsive. So if you look at the different things that happen, when I was at Reddit, I got rid of unauthorized nude porn, and we took down revenge porn. We took down anything, the celebrity photos would not be allowed under the new rules, and every single platform followed us. So Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft. All of them followed us, like they were waiting. I think that there's one like this, I don't need to do anything until the pressure is on, and two, the kind of, if it's not so hard for another platform to do it, then maybe I'll do it too, but I don't want to be the first. I don't want to be the leader. I don't want to stick my neck out and get attacked. So I think the interesting thing is now we have employees who are getting involved, and that drives even more press attention and an internal struggle, right? How you want to keep your employees happy. If you've got 20,000 of them walking out across the globe in, I think, 60 or 70 countries, then how are you actually going to function as a workplace? So I think the combination of PR and now employee activism is really going to put a lot of pressure on the platforms.
Yeah. You said before when we were talking that sometimes the things happening on platforms can be indicative of what's happening within a company. I'm wondering if you can expand on that. What do you mean by that?
I think it's, I alluded to it a little bit earlier, but the different types of kind of conflicts that are happening on platforms are often happening in the employee base as well. So, these large companies, they have people on the alt-right. They have people from, who are incels. They have people who are from the darkest parts of the internet that you don't really think about, but they're also building your platforms. They're building the tools that you're using, and they're creating these forums for conversations and interactions that mirror the society and that mirror the dialogues that are happening on top of the platform. So it's actually there has been a lot of progress in terms of the diversity and inclusion in these companies, and we're now seeing some white backlash, where people are actually feeling threatened by these changes and are trying to organize and figure out ways to prevent change.
So one of the things I get asked a lot when I cover issues of diversity and inclusion, also in response to some of these issues, is practically, how does having a more diverse staff change that if you're still going to have people who are, as you said, perhaps on the alt-right, and then you have somebody who's way far left, and you have all of these different people there? What is the thing that practically changes about how a platform runs, how those discussions are had, that would create a different experience for users?
I think people don't really understand the platforms, and I think there's a whole set of people who don't really use the platforms in the way that happens to people who are actually trying to express ideas. So if you look at the platforms, most of them, only 1% of the people create a ton of content. Facebook is a little bit different, but if you look at the different platforms, most of the people are lurkers. Most of the people don't log in, at least on Reddit and on Twitter. From a day-to-day experience, you're just looking at what's happening from the outside, and the people who are actually logged in are the people who actually understand the platform and who are generating all the content on the platform, and who are who are creating the experience for every other user. And for most people who are on these different platforms, they don't use it actively, right? So if you're not using it actively, if you're not experiencing the worst experiences, you're not really understanding how the platform is being used in its worst case scenarios. And if you are a white male, to be direct, you are not having those experiences, and you're not understanding what people are saying when they say, hey, like, this is toxic, and this is preventing me from saying what I want to say. All the people who have come off of these platforms, Lindy West, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Solange Knowles for a while, I came off a few times. It's because there's a toxicity to the platform, and not everybody else experiences it.
Yeah. I want to let the audience know that we will be coming to you for questions in just a minute or two. So mic runners are there. Same rules apply. Condense them. Make sure they're questions. I'm wondering how much validity you think there is to claims by platforms that this is a really hard line to toe, right? At what point does kind of pulling actual hate speech or actually problematic posts or actually problematic groups off a platform run into censorship?
I think we are so far from that line. Like, it is so easy to say, like, hey, we're just not going to let harassment on the platform, right? Like, you can't tell people you're going to kill them. You can't tell people, like, that is not a thoughtful idea. That's not generating political discourse. That's not helping people to, protect their rights. It's really just trying to push somebody off a platform. And that type of behavior, it's not really hard to see. It's not hard to tell. And if you make a mistake, it's not terrible that, oh, somebody was actually joking and, hey, you can put that back up. It's not like you are stopping somebody from expressing a real idea when the idea is get off the platform. I'm going to threaten you physically. I'm going to threaten you. I'm going to put your home address up. I'm going to tell people to come to your house. Those are not ideas. That's targeted harassment. And those things can come off of platforms pretty easily, but there has not been the investment in technology and in staffing that's required. And in leadership, like, you don't see these people reporting directly into the CEOs. You've got probably 2 or 3 layers before Mark Zuckerberg. Like, he's always putting Sheryl in front of it, and I don't know how many layers below Sheryl the team that's actually working on these problems sits. You don't see them. They're not part of the conversation. You don't hear them. Mark wasn't at the conversation with Color of Change. Mm-hmm. The conversations around what's going on the Facebook platform. Like, the CEO needs to own it, and the CEO needs to be part of it, and I don't see that happening on the platforms.
Do you think there are any companies, any organizations, any platforms that are actually getting it right?
I think Apple is probably the closest. I think it really takes, you have to lead by values, and I think that's the earlier conversation. I think my values as a CEO and as a company are different from the government's values. So I can ban things from my company and from my platform that are not, that are allowed in the law because I'm running a platform and I want to have certain type of conversations and I don't want to have harassment. I don't want to have, certain types of activities on my platform, and I don't want to have it in my company. So I don't have to wait for an assault to be something that is criminal. I can say, like, I don't want people to be touching people inappropriately in the workplace. I don't want people to be saying racist things in my workplace. Like, I think there's a difference that creates this false equivalence of what we're trying to say and what we're trying to do, because these situations are not the same.
Yeah, I want to go to the audience. There's right there.
Hi, I'm Mark Sullivan with Fast Company. I was really interested in your comment about what the platforms are doing about this type of toxic speech, and the idea that they're kind of just labeling it free speech and not allocating resources to stopping it. I was wondering if you have any thoughts about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which provides some legal cover for things that users post on platforms. There are people in Washington talking about revising or eliminating some parts of that. I just wondered, given everything that's happened with Facebook and the election and hate speech, if it's time to have that conversation.
Yeah, I think it is, and I think they've acknowledged it. I think there have been like specific areas where Mark Zuckerberg has said, like, oh, like, he can see the regulation coming. I don't remember exactly when it was, but pretty recently. I think, the fact that we are not able to protect people on these platforms, the fact that we are seeing them being used and manipulated to change elections, to drive, real life terrorism, it shows that it's not working. And we haven't seen solutions coming from the CEOs, coming from the boards of directors, coming from the investors to really push meaningful change that will create like this utopian, public square type of conversation instead of people just throwing things at each other and staying on two separate sides. So how do we fix that? It seems like the CEOs today don't have the answer. So I'm not a fan of regulation. I don't know that regulators are using any of these platforms and really understand how they work, but I do feel like we are at a point where, we've come to like the place where we need to actually have somebody come and regulate because the solutions are not working and the consequences are dire.
Everyone, please join me in thanking Ellen.